This is Q&A, guys. Ball's in your court.
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
And this is maybe a familiar question because it's come up a lot in my conversations, that why is it that the Jewish people had to have a kingdom form of government rather than constitutional monarchy, democracy, whatever else? And if the Jews were destined to have this type of government, is that proof that that is the optimal form of government in general? Or is it simply, what was right for the Jews at the time, or even a punishment for the Jews at the time for asking for a king?
Okay, so the question is, since the form of government that Judaism describes is a monarchy, does that mean that it's the ideal form of government for human government generally, or is it something specific about the Jewish people, or is it a punishment because they asked for a king? It's a good question. That's a good question. I think you contrast, let's say, with democracy. A form of government carries with it an understanding of where authority lies, moral authority. Who's in charge to make decisions? That's a very, very important philosophical outlook. Democracy rests on the idea that the authority to make decisions rests with each and every individual in the country. How you administer that authority depends upon a lot of variables I'm not going to go into now. I do have a whole lecture on democracy. But the bottom line is that the authority belongs to the people. That is an idea which is utterly, utterly un-Jewish. From our point of view, authority at the very least requires expertise. And people who live in democracies understand that. You don't vote on what kind of operation should be done in the hospital, and you don't vote directly on the military maneuvers of your army overseas when it's fighting battles. But here it's worse, because the only real authority is God's authority. So the only authority that we can recognize in human terms is someone who represents God. Now, you ask about monarchy. That's not strictly correct. After all, the Sanhedrin wields a gigantic amount of authority and power. The king cannot violate the laws of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin can decide whether the king has violated the laws and he should be punished for it. The idea of monarchy, where the monarch contains within him singly all the governmental authority, is very foreign to the Jewish experience. And prophets also have an independent of authority, independent of Sanhedrin, and independent of the king. So, if anything, you have a system which has an expression of division of powers, which is, I don't think, is typical in the ancient world at all. I don't think calling it a monarchy is helpful as a description of actually how the authority works. And ultimately, there's the authority of the Torah scholars, which formally is invested in the Sanhedrin, but continues even after the Sanhedrin, because those who have Torah knowledge are the ones who know what God wants. And that's the ultimate. As I said before, you need expertise. Here, the expertise that you want is that this is what God wants. So the monarch in Jewish political position is a function that one person fulfills for a certain particular types of action, but a great deal is totally independent of him. I think it's a complex system. It would require care in describing in detail what the different powers of the different ones who have authority is and how they interact with one another, before one could have a sense of what the system requires. As far as comparing Jewish political organization with the rest of the world, there's no attempt in our sources for that idea whatsoever. We have a concept, din al-malchus din, the law of the non-Jewish government is the law. Now, there's certain requirements of legitimacy that they have, but beyond that, Whether they have a democracy or whether they have a monarchy, or whether is of no interest, as far as I know, to Jewish sources. The consent of the government is a matter of interest. An imposed power, I think, according to many anyway, would be regarded just as illegitimate and having no binding force whatsoever in Jewish terms for non-Jews. Just imposed by force, no, would certainly not be accepted. Plur Vladimir, Putin would not be there. That's as much as I can tell you in this context. Yeah.
What does heresy look like in present day and age, and is there a mitzvah to warn people about heretics?
Well, heresy is an English word coming from Greek. I don't know why that would be a Jewish concept at all. There are certain violating any law of the Torah is something which you're forbidden to do, and for any reason, in any way, any kind of violation, whether it be belief, speech, or action other than speech. Some carry very serious consequences, and some carry less serious consequences. So, if someone says that Achos Lotan Timna, that Timna was the daughter, was the sister of Lotan, wasn't written by Moshe, that's heresy because he's denying a principle the Torah says is true, and you're not allowed to do that. I don't know what the word built this word that'll help to heresy. Are we talking about crimes that are worthy of death, or the word heresy doesn't communicate much? We talk about a Jewish reality. It's not a principle to violate any law or to deny any Jewish truth, any of them. Just can't do it. No, there it wasn't talking about heresy. It was talking about heretics. Talking about specific heretics. Some say specifically about the Christians, who were some of whom were Jews who went over to Christianity, that sort of thing. But it's that's in the Sephardi. The Ashkenazim don't have it. The word min is not in the Ashkenazi version of the blessing. But I don't think the English word heresy is a helpful word to describe any particular Jewish reality. Yeah.
I'm just curious how philosophers describe evil inclination, or those that do describe evil inclination that aren't Jewish, and how they describe it.
Well, philosophers who aren't Jewish would not use the term evil inclination. First of all, you have to know that on any interesting subject, philosophers are widely divided. So how philosophers would do this is a very misleading question. Because any question you have, there are at least 5 different views in the philosophical corpus. If you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is an excellent resource, free online, run by the Department of Philosophy at Stanford University, every article has, these are the main problems in the field, here are the 5 different schools of thought, and here's where they contradict, and here's hopes for further progress. I mean, but I think that, and the definition of evil varies very greatly among philosophers. There are those who are, like utilitarians, believe in the value of the outcome determining all moral considerations. And others who believe in what's called deontological theories, which are where there are rules for conduct independent of the outcome. It can be the right thing to do to create an outcome that's worse in terms of the value of the outcome. And it can be forbidden to create an outcome that's better in terms of the outcome. Well, for example, you don't kill one person to take his organs to save 5 people's lives. You don't do that. You can't kill one person to save 5 people. An outcome of 5 people surviving rather than one is a better outcome, but you don't do that because now you have to kill people for that purpose. That's a standard deontological rule that is very powerful in moral terms. So the definition of evil is going to change from system to system. So I don't think there's anything useful can be said about what philosophers do. The idea of reducing motivation to 2 basic categories labeled in moral terms, that's what I would call theological ethics and theological psychology, which I think is a legitimate field. I have a whole shiur on psychology. I think there's a critique of value-laden psychology both in its terminology and in its practice. And the critique is valid because secular psychology presents itself as if it were a science. They even have this probably oxymoron, social sciences, like psychology, anthropology, and sociology, and learning theory, and all the rest. What's that?
How is science defined, though, in that?
How is science defined? I will take a few minutes for a footnote here, because this is the standard trick of the sophomore philosophy student who says, define your terms. And the implication is, if you can't define your terms, you don't know what you're talking about. If you don't know what you're talking about, then you should just keep quiet. But that's dead wrong. That's dead wrong. Defining your terms is not a precondition for a reasonable discussion. Because if it were, you couldn't have an investigation to find the definition. Because investigating what the definition should be is using the term and judging whether a definition is appropriate or not. And if you really didn't understand the term at all without a definition, you couldn't look for a definition. That's not correct. And every philosopher knows this. It's only the sophomores after the third beer who say, define your terms. Right? The rough truth is this, that any term that you pick will have a white, black, and gray area. There are some things where it definitely doesn't apply to, some things where it definitely does apply, and there's some things which are difficult. And difficult can come in two stripes. It can either mean that it's controversial, or it can mean that individuals are not sure what to say. Now, if you're having a discussion using a term, and you are careful to keep the discussion in the black and white areas, not to stray into the gray area, then the demand for a definition is unjustified, because it's the black and white areas of the term that you're going to use to evaluate proposed definitions. And then you use the definition to clarify the gray area. So when a person says, give me a definition, the response should be, show me where we have strayed into the gray area. If we have, then you're right. We can't go on because we don't really know what we're talking about. But if we stayed in the black and white areas, then you're not right, and we don't need a definition. I don't think I've done anything that has strayed out of the black and white areas of the terms that I'm using. By the way, there is no accepted definition of truth. Truth is a big problem, has been for thousands of years in philosophy, right? But when Jones is on the witness stand under oath and says, I saw the murder, and two witnesses come in and say, the murder was in Tucson, and you were with us in Shanghai, he's in trouble. And if he says to the judge, but Your Honor, you can't even define truth. How are you going to accuse me of lying and prosecute me? He's not going to win with that defense. He's going to lose. He's going to go to jail for perjury. There's no question about it. And he belongs going to jail for perjury. You don't need a definition of truth to decide whether he's lying when he said he was in Tucson when he was really in Shanghai. So the raising the question of a definition is something which it has to be justified.
Well, so social sciences, it sounds like you think falls on the black part of the...
I would like them to explain to me what they mean by science and justify it. Then tell me what they mean by science.
It seems like...
Are the results reproducible? Is the methodology agreed upon? Are they describing the same subject? We had a famous, infamous philosopher who wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. Okay? The reviewer in Journal of Philosophy said a better title would have been Consciousness Ignored, because he didn't address the subject. This is a science? They can't agree what the subject is? Come on, let's be, but I'll put it in there, I'll put it on them. You tell me what you mean by science, and you show me that what you're saying is true, and then maybe I'll accept it. Meantime, I don't know any definition of science, any concept of science that applies to what you're doing. So, if you read the literature, there's a website called Retraction Watch, just listing all the papers that are retracted from journals, published papers that are later retracted because it turns out that it didn't work right and it wasn't done correctly and the methodology wasn't justifiable and it wasn't reproducible and so forth and so on. And they're very, very heavily in the so-called social fields, I would call them.
Sorry to interrupt your train of thought on his question.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry.
So where were we at?
It's about the evil and... So they're different. They're going to call different things evil. Oh, so
The problem with psychology is this, that it presents itself as if it's a repository of objective truths. When the psychologists put forth their what their discipline supports, we are supposed to follow the science and accept their points of view because they're the ones who are in control of information about the world that is actually realistic. When you discover that a great deal of what they're doing is value-laden, that undermines their pretense to be objective. But when we talk about Jewish psychology, it doesn't pretend to be objective. It doesn't pretend to be pseudoscientific. It is an expression of a theological, moral point of view, and using those terms to describe psychological reality. So there's no harm in having a psychology with values built in, as long as it doesn't pretend to be something else. The secular psychologists pretend to be something else. You take a concept like maturity that you have in child development, right? You define certain attitudes and certain behaviors as mature. Is maturity a value-neutral term? I hope this is a no-brainer. When you saw something which was immature, is that a compliment? Is that a neutral description like you did it on Friday? I don't think so. Immature is a gross insult. So if you say maturity is X, you're recommending the value of treating this as valuable. That's not what psychology, that's what a science is supposed to do. Tell you what's valuable, what's more important, less important than something else. But by using words like mature, there was a guy named Thomas, I don't know what his name is, S-A-Z-S, Thomas Saz, wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness. You call something an illness, you're saying it's bad. Well, that's a value judgment. And it's not obvious at all. In fact, in the 70s, when the question was raised, is homosexuality an illness? And the American Psychological Association voted that it isn't, something like 55 to 45. That means 45% said it is. Okay, but that's a majority, right? So then it was accepted that you couldn't say it was an illness, and all the research dried up. Because we're trying to help people. We're trying to make people's lives better. If it's not an illness, then there's no reason in researching it. We can't help people with it. We're taking illnesses and making people healthy. We want to dedicate to making the world a better place. Okay. But whether or not it's an illness, whether or not it's a desirable or undesirable condition, that's not something that certainly a psychologist should say, just like it's not up to a doctor to say that a certain condition is healthy or unhealthy, or bad or good, and that's carried by healthy and unhealthy. If you read Oliver Sacks, people with Tourette's syndrome, and there are drugs that can control it, but it also makes their lives dull and gray. And for some people, what they prescribe is Monday through Friday, take the drugs, and Saturday and Sunday, don't take the drugs. I'd be wild and pounding the ceiling and kicking at the floor. Yeah, but you're alive, right? And maybe you prefer that. Who says that the expression of the syndrome is bad? Who said so? He was on an airplane flight. The pilot was a surgeon, had Tourette's syndrome. You know, he's flying the plane and pounding the ceiling and flying the plane. And he flew the plane, you know, so, you know, who's to say? Okay, anyway, that's a pet peeve of mine. Yeah.
So what are the implications of the fact that we have that we cannot get rid of the tumah of the dead? Like, what are the implications that there is a level of tumah we cannot get rid of?
Okay, what are the implications of the fact that we can't get rid of the tumah of contact with the dead? Well, there are certain kinds of contact with things that are holy that are forbidden when you have the tumah, the disqualification of having been in contact with the dead, and that applies to almost everyone on the planet. Or every Jew on the planet, anyway. It's one of the reasons why you can't go up onto the Temple Mount, even though some people say you can, and they all have all sorts of excuses and so on and so on. What else would it apply to? I mean, if we had truma, you wouldn't be able to eat truma. In fact, when we take off truma, it becomes tummy right away. We burn it. It's not like giving it to a kohen to eat. You can't do it because it's tummy. It's in his tummy. You can't eat it. So we take off the truma that we take off, and we burn it. I'll tell you, there's a wonderful definition of tuma that I heard from my first wife, Shalom. She called tuma a mini kores. Kores means being cut off from God. Tuma cuts you off from contact with certain types of sanctified things. So, of many of the things that were sanctified and had those rules, we don't have anyway. We don't use them anyway. But in times when the temple was standing and sacrifices were being offered, then it was a big deal. If you had any kind of tumah, you were disqualified from doing that. In fact, I think it's in one of the cities in northern Israel where they have significant archaeological digs. There's a whole section of houses where there were a lot of mikvos. And they opine that this is where the people who processed olive oil to have it in the temple for the menorah and for the menachos, and it had to be pure. So these people had to be pure. So any kind of tumah that they were subject to, all tumah requires going to mikveh. Whatever kind it is, however long it is, whatever else it might require, requires going to mikveh. So they had mikvahs there so to make sure that they were pure in order to be able to make the olive oil. With where we are today, we couldn't do it because the tumah that we have is irrevocable. So when the temple will be rebuilt, we'll be able to take care of it. Yeah.
So for someone who's Baal Tshuva and grew up completely secular, a modern Orthodox life can seem like a good approach for slower, gradual growth. What are the pros and cons of living this type of lifestyle? I've heard mixed things depending on.
What are the pros and cons of living
No, but
modern Orthodox?
Yeah, just like what are some, because we talk about gradual growth, and sometimes a lot of people who are growing, they can jump into things too fast and experience burnout, and some people fall away from the religion altogether.
Okay, so we're talking about how gradual development should be as someone's coming in from the outside, and whether, I guess this is part of the question, whether a modern Orthodox style of Jewish life would be a reasonable, at least, starting position, because it enables you to develop more slowly and more smoothly than perhaps being in a Haredi environment. So I believe in the slow and steady development. I agree with you. And I have seen cases where people they overextend themselves, and then there comes a crunch, and some don't make it. I have seen that actually happen. So I think that's a very realistic attitude. In fact, I try to communicate to students who are here, you're receiving a lot of information quickly. And what you need to do is have like two lists. One is a list of things I must do, and other list of things I must work towards. This one I'll get to in 2 years, and this one I'll get to in 5 years, and this one I'll get to in 10 years. And I would say 80% of what you learn has to go on the second list. You can't be sitting there in class and saying, this and this and this and this. Okay, tomorrow morning's going to be different. You can't do that. It's inconceivable. You just don't have the ability to do it. So that's one way to protect yourself. Now, whether environment which is less intense is necessary depends upon who are the people in the population. There are Haredi environments where there's room for people who are on their way in. This yeshiva is a Haredi yeshiva, and it is famous for making room for people to live here in the dorm. And in the beginning, on Saturdays they go to kibbutz, or they go to Tel Aviv to go swimming, and so on and so on. They come back, they take on Shabbos gradually. We create a Haredi environment that's user-friendly for people who are on the way in and making gradual progress. I can understand how many Haredi environments wouldn't be user-friendly in that way, and I can understand why, let's say, being in a less intense environment would be something that would be desirable. Yes, I think that could very well be desirable. And I think that if the person is growth-oriented, his eyes open, and he thinks about evaluating what he sees, eventually the vast majority will come to, they'll become hopefully qualified and capable, and will want a more intense environment. That's what I would hope. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to say about this. I think the biggest barrier for a man is the level of Torah knowledge. This environment stresses Torah knowledge very strongly. And Torah knowledge and understanding has a strong impact on your standing in the group, how seriously you're taken in the group, and discussions and decisions and so on and so on. Many, many people who become Baalei Tshuva never make it to a position of serious scholarship in Haredi terms. That's hard. That's really hard. So anyway, I had a student who became a professor of law, never went to yeshiva. And when he would be asked questions, he would say, let's go to the Rabbi, my Rabbi, the Boston Rabbi, or go to people in the shul who are knowledgeable, and we'll get an answer. He wasn't embarrassed. He didn't think he had to have all the answers. Someone challenged him and said, look, I saw what I saw, and I made my decision. If you want to test it, go take a look for yourself and see what you see, and see whether you come to my conclusion or not. Am I going to convince you, argue with you, prove something to you? No, I'm not going to do that. He was a professor of law, so but he didn't present himself that way. So he has managed to integrate into a very Haredi community without having all the knowledge. Some people find that very pressured and very difficult. I could imagine someone saying, I can't do that. I can't be in a position where, what are my children going to say? You know? And my 11-year-old comes home and says, Tati, please help me with my homework. And I'm sorry, I can't read your homework. I don't know. I don't know the answers to the questions, right? For an 11-year-old, they find that difficult to do. I know someone who became a Baal Tshuva and lived in a city with two schools for children, the one more Haredi and one less Haredi. And he put his children in the less Haredi school because he said, I don't want to lose touch with my children. I don't want to come to a point where they don't respect me. I don't want to be able to interact with them in terms of the schoolwork. I said, but what about the quality of education your children will get? He said, I can't do that. I thought that was sad. I remember my oldest son took down a Mishnah Berurah, I think he was 16. He said, Abba, look what the Mishnah Berurah says. And I was wrong. I was dead wrong about it. I thought, wow, I have a 16-year-old son who could take down a Mishnah Berurah and show me where I'm wrong. That was a very happy day for me. My own son was able to do that. It was a very happy day. Yeah, it's only not everybody can take that. I think what you suggested, it makes sense in general, and each person has to find his own way. Yeah.
Building off the idea that Torah is a very important thing to strive towards, especially for Baal Tshuva to kind of maybe break into the community a little bit more. And in pirkei avos, it's one of the three pillars of the world, right?
Torah
also, avodah is one of them, right? It's a lot of tefillah, or is it referring to tefillah specifically?
Well, it's referring really specifically to the sacrifices in the temple, but tefillah is part of that.
Okay.
Tefillah is part of that.
My question is basically, I mean, I know you, based on your shir in the past, you had a shir on the Shemona Esrei, but it seems that in the yeshiva system, that there doesn't seem to be much study of tefillah and pursuit of trying to grow in that area. And so, I mean, I was curious what your thoughts are on that in terms of how the system works, and could it be improved, or is it a problem, or what should a person try to do themselves?
Yeah. Oh, okay. The question is, one of the pillars in which the world rests is avodah. Avodah, pirkei avos. Avodah can mean service in the temple, and also prayer, which really are very, very tightly bound up with one another, as I'll explain in a moment, Yis Hashem. And how is it that in many yeshivas, prayer isn't studied? The text of prayer, the idea of prayer isn't studied. So, there are a lot of things that aren't studied. A lot of things which really should be studied aren't studied. And when I say should be, there's what philosophers call a prima facie obligation, even though some philosophers, on the basis of the Latin, say it's not appropriate. John Searle says it's not an appropriate phrase. That's the way it's used. Prima facie obligation means these are things which need to be done, but I have limited resources, time, effort, and the rest. So maybe I can't get to that one because I'm getting to other ones that need to be done. Tanakh. You're worried about prayer? What about the Bible? How about studying that? Even Chumash isn't studied carefully, let alone Isaiah and Job and Daniel. What about the comprehensiveness of your knowledge as opposed to the depth of your knowledge? There are 2,700 folios of Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. How many of those do you cover in normal yeshiva education? So that's gotten better. The idea of having broad knowledge is also important. Different groups have different approaches to it. The Sanzer Hasidim, if a boy is tested on 1,000 daf, 1,000 folios before he's married, he gets to wear white socks. He's called Moreni, our teacher. 1,000 dafs is a lot to be tested on. It's like 40% of the entire Talmud. So they also stress breadth as well as depth. But prayer is important. When Yeshivat Solomon, who is the Mashgiach of Lakewood Yeshiva, was first brought there. He was brought there from Manchester, England, to be a Mashgiach. The first thing he did at Elul was to teach prayer. You're coming to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Those days are days of prayer. The whole 10 days of, first 10 days of Tishrei are days of prayer. You ought to know what you're saying. So he taught it to them. So that was a radical move. That's what a Mashgiach is about. He's about avodah. That's what he's about, teaching people how to serve God. So he did it. But you're right. I think the point here is that there's been a selective process that we study certain things for certain purposes. And one of the great purposes of the last 250 years was that the students should stay observant, because they're under pressure from the endarkment, which is the true description of what they call the Enlightenment, and study Jewish studies that are based on sophisticated analysis became very important to the emotion of everything else. The Gemara is quite clear. By the way, we don't study the Torah the way it says in the Gemara at all. Not at all. The Mishnah says 5, you start Mikra, which is Tanakh. Spend 5 years just on Tanakh. Almost nobody does that today. And then 5 more years on Mishnayos. You start Gemara at 15. Nobody does that today. Not only that, but first there's Girsa. Girsa means knowing everything, just knowing what it says. And then Svara afterwards, coming to analyze and understand and answer contradictions, comes after you have comprehensive knowledge of what it says. That's almost not practiced. So when you ask, it's really, I think, there's an overall religious need for the study of Torah to produce a person who's serving God. And that has changed the priorities that we have in Torah study. There are those sources which indicate that you really ought to study applicable Torah first. Well, let's see. This ox gored that ox, and that ox died, and so forth and so on. Well, it's definitely practical law, but it's not practical for us. How many people do you know that own oxen? None. 0. So, could it be your car? Okay, trade the car. What about brachos? What about Shabbos? What about Be'ah for Yom Tov? I mean, there are masechtas that deal with practical law, and they aren't emphasized. They aren't prioritized. So, I think that it's more the overall social religious need that dictates what's learned and what isn't learned. Yeah.
So this question is kind of twofold. That Firstly, is slavery, according to the Torah, b'diavad or lechachila? And based on that, should we, like as Jews nowadays, try to avoid merchandise that was produced by a large part through slave and or underpaid exploitation labor?
Okay, so the first question is whether slavery is something which is regarded as, let's say, perfectly acceptable normal behavior, or whether it's something which is only what he calls it in Hebrew, b'diavad, second class. I don't think it could be justified only because there are pressures or special needs, but ideal society would not have slavery as part of it. And then, if there is something second class about slavery, should we avoid products that are rely on slave labor? And then, of course, in the middle of your question, you realize that what we call slavery is probably very rare, except for Muslim countries in North Africa that have black slaves, which nobody ever talks about, not even so-called people who are interested in justice. But then there exploited, underpaid, workers and so on and so on. There are really two questions, and each one of them is complex. I couldn't give you any final answer about either question, but I could offer some observations. First of all, there's a gigantic difference between Jews being slaves to other Jews versus non-Jews being slaves to Jews. Their status and their treatment is very, very different from one another. A Jew being a slave to another Jew is b'diavad. It's second class. The ideal is that should have never happened. No question about that. It can happen in two ways. One is that someone owes money and he can't pay it. And he wants to pay it. If he sells himself, let's say he sells his labor for 6 years, he gets a payment up front. He can use that to pay the one person that he owes, and now he's required to work off that money for the person who bought him. But this is really what they call an indentured servant, and it shows in many ways. For one thing, if the Jew who is the slave comes into money, he can buy his way out immediately, and the one who bought him can't protest. He just owes money. He's working off the money that he owes. Number two, he's required to live by all but one of all the commandments, and he keeps Shabbos, and he keeps the holidays, and the owner has to provide him with that. His standard of living can't be less than that of the owner. So Tosfos says if there's one pillow in the house, the slave gets it. The master can't have it because he can't have more than what the slave has. The slave can't be asked to do anything that the master would find degrading to do. So there's a lot of restrictions that are put on this. And the normal course is 6 years. At the end of 6 years, he goes free automatically. Unless he wants to stay a slave, which could happen, and that's all procedure, then he goes free in the Jubilee. But so it is definitely second class. And the way the Torah puts it is, I am your master, and you went and got yourself another master. That's bad. So it's legal, but it's definitely bad. The other way that it can happen is if he stole, a Jew stole, and he hasn't got the money to pay it back, then the court could sell him. But again, it's to pay off a debt. And he can always get out of the slavery condition that he's in by paying the rest if he comes into money. So to call this slavery is really very peculiar, I think. Yes, the Torah uses the word avot, there's no question, it does use that word, but the English word slavery carries with it connotations which are utterly, utterly different from the reality of that kind of slavery. A non-Jewish slave is a different matter, and that was very rare. That happened either because non-Jews enslaved each other and sold one of their slaves to us, or in war sometimes. That's a different matter. I'm not going to go into it right now. But yes, it definitely is second class. Now, this idea of not supporting industries that, it's sort of like the BDS people, right? You use a computer, your Intel chip was made in Israel. You have a climate control in your house, the AI was made in Israel. So on and so on. You know, come on, be serious. Don't drive a car. Every car has inventions that were made in Israel. Right? So at a certain point, it becomes absurd to express your opposition to something by killing your own life. So, and if you as an individual are a minuscule, insignificant, non-functioning portion of the market that they're selling to. So that you do or you don't is going to make any difference whatsoever in what they're doing. So then it's a question of a kind of general attitude. I don't want to be part of that, and so on and so on. But to pin it down on a person saying, you're supporting them, so they're making more profit, so create more of these things, hire more of these laborers, and you take your $10,000 in a lifetime of buying their products and divide it up among the million people who are making it as less than a penny per person. So you're not actually changing the output of that system at all. So that's a question of not, so having a kind of pure conscience that I didn't participate in any way. That's not a very strong moral imperative. It can be something that's desirable, but it's not a very strong moral imperative. So I would say that each case would have to be decided on its own merits, depending on what the terrible crime was. And some of these things, exploited. Why? Because the workers in India aren't being paid the same salary as the workers in Los Angeles? Is that the exploitation? Who's exploiting them? Is it their own authority systems there that are forcing them to work for less, right? Which you're not going to change, right? I don't know. It's complicated and subtle. I don't think it's a very strong question, but it could be discussed. And now I'm out of my depth to explain, what the seriousness would be in our terms. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to know. I know it might be a wide question, but what can be said about what can we know or understand from the shofar, like the voice of the shofar? Like what is the meaning of why, for example, why do we refer it as the voice of the shofar, or how can, like, why, for example, there's certain techniques of why do you play 1 and 3 and 9, or like where can that be found? I mean, that's a question. Like either there's a lot of things beyond the shofar, I know. So
Okay, there's a question, the symbolism of the shofar. First of all, don't read into the word kol, voice. Kol can just mean sound.
Okay.
It doesn't mean somebody's talking and so on and so on. That's not part of it. We have the word kol doesn't mean voice, it means sound.
Right.
Now, there are in Midrash, even in the Talmud, the punctuated sounds are sounds of distress. The straight sounds are the sound of happiness, of joy, of positiveness, of strength. And they usually you have straight punctuated and straight because the beginning and the end has to be positive. And then there are things that has to be dealt with in the middle. And it was used for many different functions, calling together the leaders of the people, or signaling a march, a trek of the people going from place to place. It's used in Rosh Hashanah, and the Rambam writes in the Mishnah Torah that the symbolism there is to wake up from your sleep of dogmatism, your sleep of insensitivity, your sleep of embeddedness in the physical world, material world, and the preoccupation with things which dull your spiritual sensitivity. I will give you one more piece of symbolism, which I think is very important, and then I'm going to leave it. The Gemara says, based on a verse in Isaiah, Dirshu Hashem b'himotzo, kra'u b'yosu karov. Seek out Hashem when he's near, when he's present. Call to him when he's close. And the Gemara says it's talking about individuals, not the nation. God is always close to the nation, always listening to the nation, always in contact with the nation. But this is talking about individuals. When is God found and close? The 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. And one way in which this closeness expresses itself is this. Let's suppose a person does something wrong, and he realizes it, and he does tshuva. So, when he does something wrong, he's taken a step back away from God, and God takes a corresponding step back away from him. So there's a double distance set up. Now, when he does tshuva, he goes back to his original position, but there's still a distance that God created by separating himself. Will God respond by closing the distance? Maybe not right away. Maybe not right away. There's no guarantee. He did the transgression in January, he did tshuva in February. Maybe God won't close the distance in February. There's no rule about it, no guarantee about it. What's unique about the first 10 days of the month of Tishrei, the days from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur, is that there God comes first. He closes his side of the distance before you do tshuva. He's waiting for you. He's there with his hand out to you. So when you do tshuva, you're connected immediately. That's a gigantic advantage. Now, the shofar is an instrument of the type that announces something. And one explanation of the shofar blown on the morning of Rosh Hashanah is the arrival of the king in our midst. It's signaling that he's present. I think that's what could generate the Rambam's response. Well, the king is here, wake up, you know. He's not sitting in the capital 1,000 miles away. He's here right in front of you. How do I know that that's what it symbolizes? Because what is the very last thing that you do at the end of Yom Kippur? The last action that you perform in the Yom Kippur service, at the end of the day, what's the last thing you do? You blow the shofar. Now, if you're using the right kind of siddur, which means either a Sephardi siddur or a Hasidic siddur, using Ashkenazi siddur, too bad. Right? It has an instruction. Next to the words that you blow the shofar, it says, Siluk Shechina, the departure of the Shechina. Makes exactly the right reaction. Wow. The departure of God's presence. Which means that just the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur signals the departure of God's presence. The shofar at the beginning of Rosh Hashanah signals the arrival of God's presence. And I must tell you, in terms of my own personal experience, I find that moment almost painfully poignant, because on the one hand, you've been through the 10 days, the day of Yom Kippur itself, and hopefully you've gotten a grip on yourself and a new vision for your future, and you have resolve and enthusiasm in building a new future. That's wonderful. And but you're losing a HaKadosh Baruch Hu's closeness. You're losing that. So it's like the pang of saying goodbye. It's an excruciatingly difficult moment with a swirl of competing emotions. So that, I think, is this. I would say that's the symbolism which underlies all the other symbolisms that you hear about. It's really announcing God's arrival in our midst on Rosh Hashanah and his disappearance at the end of Yom Kippur. That's something about the shofar. But there's a lot more, because we'll go back to the shofar that was on the ram of Yitzchak, and the shofar which is going to announce the Mashiach. All those things are tied in. There's big literature about it. Yeah.
What are some of the greatest arguments and disprovers of macroevolution?
So I'm not going to argue to disprove. I'm going to share with you, I did this in the last hour, I'm going to share with you an observation which I think is the more important observation. I think it's I know what's going on, but maybe this could wait till after we finish. I think it's more important to realize that it is inappropriate to accept it. That doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just that it's inappropriate to accept it. And the reason that it's inappropriate is this. Evolution says that life developed by a process which is uncontrolled, undirected, and unmanaged. Sometimes they call it accidental, sometimes they call it random. Accidental does not have a good definition. Random does not have a good definition. But uncontrolled, unfocused, and unmanaged. Now, somebody wants to tell me that something happened in an uncontrolled, unfocused, and unmanaged manner. He has to give me some estimate. What is the probability of that happening in the conditions that apply? If you can't give me an estimate of the probability, then I can't make up my mind whether to believe that it really was uncontrolled, unfocused, and unmanaged, or rather managed by some process that you're not aware of. So I would ask a person who is a believer in evolution and thinks that I ought to believe also, show me your estimate of the probability that life developed by random accidental, which doesn't have a good definition, but unfocused, unmanaged, and unprogrammed processes of mutations and changes in gene expression, all the rest of it. What's the probability that it happened that way? As they say, it's not the survival of the fittest that's the question, it's the arrival of the fittest that's the question. It can only survive once it's arrived. It's only arrived because they have these variations which produce the different varieties of life, some of which are better suited to survive. So if you can't do that, then you have no business telling me I ought to believe it. My analogy is, if I tell you I have an object, and I painted an X on one side of the object, and I threw the object into the air 3 times, and 3 times in a row it landed on the X by accident, unfocused, unmanaged, uncontrolled, and I asked, would you believe me or not? So if you think I'm talking about a coin, then it's a 1 in 8 chance, 12.5%. Of course you could accept it easily. If I'm talking about a shilyagan, which has 1,000 sides, then you're talking on 1 in a billion shot. That's the American billion with 9 zeros, not the British billion with 12 zeros. And it was 1 in a billion shot, so they wouldn't believe me. And if I tell you, well, it's my object, and I'm not telling you how many sides it has, but I want you to believe me, I think you would respond, excuse me, if I don't know how many sides it is, how can I make up my mind whether to believe you or not? If you don't tell me what the probability of arriving at this envelope of life via the process that you're talking about, if you don't know what the probability is, some estimate, I can't make up my mind logically to believe you or not. Well, they haven't done it, and they can't do it, and it's quite obvious that they can't do it. And if you have doubts about it, I will tell you what I have told all my students over the last 40 years. Write to your biology professors, write to your philosophy professors, write to Richard Dawkins. Get me the estimate probability. Show me how they went through 4.25 billion years of development of life, and all the mutations that took place, and all the physical conditions of the earth during all those periods where the mutations were taking place, and what the probability is of it happening just by accident. Show me. And if you can't do that, which you obviously can't, then you have no business telling me that I have to accept it. That, I think, is the most important point. I think there are lots of problems with it. You want to read a guy who's qualified to talk about it? David Gelernter. David Gelernter is a professor of computer science at Yale. So I suppose he's not dumb. And he gave up Darwin on the basis of a certain calculation. And he wrote an article for the Claremont Review of Books, which you can Google online. You can get it very easily. He collects there some of the standard anti-evolution arguments, which he says are relevant and have weight. But there's the problem of protein folding, where the percentage of functional proteins in the space of all possible proteins, because of all the different folds that they have, is like 1 in 10 to the 70, or maybe worse than that. And 1 in 10 to 70 would mean that you would need quadrillions of universes for quadrillions of years to get one. And we have lots more than one. They said, he's a professor of computer science. Numbers are his home. He understands numbers. And he says, this is just beyond calculation, beyond computation. This is something which is really, probability is equal to 0. It's just not acceptable to and he says, I don't believe in artificial intelligence. I'm not signing on to that. He happens to be a religious Jew, but he says, I'm not saying God did it, but I'm telling you, this doesn't work. This doesn't work. So On the one hand, they can't give you enough information to make up your mind to accept it. And it is possible if you take one tiny little well-defined corner to say, this corner kills it. You take a look at his paper. So that would be a good start for someone who was serious about the subject, which is now down to 0.1% of the people who talk about it. There's a video, if you want to see it. I gave a shiur criticizing Dawkins. Somebody found Dawkins giving an exposition of his basic points, which is maybe like 15 minutes long, and he found my shiur and he put them together in a single video. You can look it up on YouTube. Just look up Dawkins and Gottleib, and you'll get the. I think it worked out very well. I mean, I didn't know about his video when I did it, but I do answer the points that he makes there. So it's quite amusing.